Now you have this chapter about the totalitarian man. Could you explain how these philosophical schools led to that, which we're in currently, it seems, would you say?
Well, again, my thinking about this derives originally from a book by a man called Talmon, which was written after the Second World War, called The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy. The totalitarian in its modern form, the first clear example of it is in the French Revolution.
Yeah.
Now, obviously there were philosophical influences on the French Revolution, Rousseau, Voltaire, different people, but feeding into it. But probably neither of them really would have agreed with what the revolutionaries actually did. And you've got a new mix, as it were. But the new mix has certain extraordinary features which are marks of all later totalitarianism. One of the features of totalitarianism is it removes the difference between public and private life. Everything is public, everything is political.
Right.
You can't pull out. I mean, in ancient societies, for example, if you lost an argument, so to speak, politically, you might well be eliminated, but if you weren't, you could withdraw to private life and you'd be left alone. But that's what the totalitarian, since the revolution, actually denies, that you can't escape. Everything is political, and there's no such thing as private life. And that's the reason why, for example, the attack on the family has become so important after the French Revolution. The French revolutionaries didn't go that far, but pretty quickly other people did, as it were. And it's the logical end of the process. They also, of course, wanted to protect private property. Which was, as it were, a sacred cow in the 18th century since Locke. I mean, Locke regards possession of property as one of the fundamental marks of human beings. But and that was preserved. But very soon, people began to say that the French Revolution, yes, they started the right way. They'd abolished the public-private distinction, but they hadn't really applied this. If you did, the implications further are the abolition of the family and abolition of property. Everything's got to belong to the state in this sense. Whether it's left or right doesn't make any difference. See, I would want to say that ultimately there is very little difference between the left and the right totalitarianism. And that totalitarian also, and I think we made this point in the book, it's not the same as authoritarianism. Totalitarian does depend on the notion that ultimately to the good is what the rulers want, whereas some forms of authoritarianism say that the authoritarian thing is right, is okay, as long as the boss wants the right things. Totalitarian just said, I decide what is right. The authoritarian may not do that. In fact, he often doesn't. He's we would call it paternalism or something like that. The ancient philosophers, political philosophers, tended to divide the world not primarily into different sorts of political systems like democracy or aristocracy or kingship. Their more basic distinction was always between those states where the ruler rules in his own interest only, and those states in which the ruler rules in the interest of the whole community. So that's their most within that, they would say you could have monarchs on either side. You'd call the bad guy a tyrant, but he's a person who rules with only concern with his own interest. Similarly, with an aristocracy could either be a group of elite people who nevertheless want the good of the whole community or only want their own good. If they're the latter, you call them oligarchs. And similarly in the case of democracy, ancient democracies actually were really much more like the power of the overriding power of the majority. You can almost say dictatorship of the majority. Modern democracies are different from that, so that they are, in this sense, less totalitarian because they will allow that the minority has rights. Yeah. In ancient democracies, the minority might have rights, but only if the majority thought it was worthwhile giving them to them. Right. Whereas but the introduction of rights theory has changed this. But of course that raises further question, what is a right?
Yes, yes.
And the totalitarianism is seen in Stalinist Russia, where private property is pretty well abolished.
Yes, yes.
And what's the story of Malcolm Muggeridge is quite interesting in this regard.
Mm.
Well, the interesting thing about Muggeridge was, yes, he went to Moscow as a communist, threw away his passport and so on, became a Soviet citizen living in Moscow. But then one day he took a little trip outside and looked into the countryside. I realised that people were starving to death and saw bodies in the streets and things like that. Mm. Well, that's not entirely surprising. The really fascinating thing about this one, though, is that when he sent his report back to his editor in The Guardian, the editor of The Guardian refused to accept it. It couldn't possibly be true in a perfect society.
Right,
he refused to print it.
Right.
Well, Muggeridge, that was the end of his communism, basically.
Yes. We have a soft totalitarianism now, if you like, in the West that's developing. Would you agree with that? And why is that? Why does that come about? Would you say?
You mean the liberal totalitarianism?
Yes.
Well, I think it comes about. Well, first of all, you see, liberals want, in some sense, a Christian world without Christianity. That's the first step. But secondly, it's a world in which things are always going to get better. This is an inheritance certainly from the Enlightenment in modern liberalism. And in theological terms, it's based on the denial of the Christian theory of original sin, which became very strong in that period. I mean, it was played down to some extent by the churches. Not after the first generation of the Reform, it began to be played down. It's rejected out of hand by almost all thinkers in the 17th century, and becomes a mark of, quote, religious bigotry or obscurantism or whatever. But in fact, this is a wholly unjustified attitude by the liberals, in my view. Long ago, in a book I wrote about Augustine himself, I pointed out that Augustine's very pessimistic account of human nature looked okay. It might look sad, as it were, unfortunate, and indeed, if not dreadful, in a cosy Victorian parlour, as it were, where you could chat with your friends and so on and so forth. But in view of the history of the 20th century, Augustine's been proved right. I was very much impressed once when I read a book which is called Warfare by an atheist called Paul Fussell. It's an interesting book because it's about the attitude of people, both civilians and military, during the Second World War. And as I can remember that war, I read the book, so I was trying to think whether my memories fitted with what's in the book. And I was very impressed that not only did they fit, but he said things there which I was, oh yes, that's right, I remember that. Well, there's one particular section of that book where he quotes, this is an atheist, I think, Paul Fussell. He quotes the words used by Martha Gellhorn, who was embedded in the US troops who entered, I think it was one of the concentration camps, I think it was Dachau. And she wrote back saying something like, what we saw is incomprehensible to the liberal imagination. Only a long discarded theory of human depravity could begin to explain it. Well, of course, that's Augustine's theory that she's alluding to there. This is the theory of original sin. No liberal theory can account for what happened in the 20th century. That is my claim. This is one of the fundamental things wrong with liberalism, in fact. It just doesn't answer to the human experience, as it were. The interesting thing about liberal intellectuals, you see, is that they have the habit again and again of denying reality in this kind of matter. We saw it with Hitler, we saw it with Stalin, sheer lying in many cases about what goes on, and it still goes on.
Well, I was going to say, because we were talking earlier about how things you were recalling things in the 1960s and how things were, and now you say that there's a complete denial of reality now.
Yes.
Could you explain that a bit more? How things have changed since the sort of liberalism you experienced in the 1960s to now? Would you say?
Well, I suppose in some sense this is the move from modernism, extreme form modernism, to postmodernism. The 60s revolutionaries, I can remember them quite well because I was involved in these things in the University of Toronto. They were liberals and often left liberals, but people certainly prone to violence in many cases, but they had a clear idea, I think, of some sort of paradise they were going to construct, as it were. The difference between those people and what you've got now is that the present people have adopted certain, I would say, clearly totalitarian attitudes which did not exist in the 60s. This comes out most strikingly when they start talking about gender and sex and so on. George Orwell said in 1984, I think it was there, certainly it comes up in 1984, that the aim of the totalitarian is to persuade people, by whatever means, to deny the obvious evidence of their senses. And that's exactly what the so-called third generation of feminists and the like, and some of their acolytes among the LGBT movement are trying to do. They're simply saying there's no difference between men and women because I say there isn't. This is triumph of the will in a new form, if you like, and now a liberal form.
Yes.
But it's the same sort of thing as the Nazis in that sense. You believe this or else I'll cancel you out or cut your head off or whatever it's going to be. And you see it, other feature of this. Now people are saying, for example, it's criminal to be white in America. People are saying this now. In the same way as the Nazis said it's criminal to be Jewish. Because those claims are similar because in both cases you can't help what you're being accused of. You can't, if you're a Jew, you can't help being a Jew. If you're white, you can't help being white. But if Jews and whites are similarly undesirable people, in the end, the final solution is the only way out, it seems. And if you can't actually kill them, certainly you've got to make sure they have no voice in society.
And the philosophical roots of all this prevailing contemporary revisionist thinking comes from...
It's the theories of the will in the 19th century. It's the theories of, it's the notion of that, as I say, this is Plato's alternative world. The only thing that matters, the only thing that's real is power. And power means I can do it. Goering, I think, was quoted as saying, well, he was asked once what is power, and it's my fist on your throat. And that's a very good example of what is meant by power in this sense. I mean, it doesn't have to be violent. You might have other means of shutting people up, but you're still trying to shut them up and making sure they can't speak.
Now you talk about original tradition, is but how can we get back to original tradition? What are the solutions to the current state we're in, and do we have the philosophical tools now to get us out of the current state, would you say?
I think we have the tools, but it's going to be a long process. It can't be done quickly.
I was going to say you could read John's books.
No, but see, when Socrates wasn't the first philosopher, but he's, in a sense, he's at the root of what we think of philosophy now. He has predecessors, and they're important, but let's say it's with Socrates. Socrates claimed he didn't know anything. And he claimed he was right there, and that made him better than everybody else because they all thought they did know something. So, in other words, the first thing to do is to clear away the rubbish. Until you've done that, you can't start thinking again. Well, that's exactly what this book is about. The rubbish is what's accumulated since the death or near death of the original tradition. So you've got to go back to that, but not unmitigated. I mean, some people think you can solve this problem by going back to what I call a Thomism of strict observance, for example. I've no time for that. And I don't think Thomas would have any time for it either, as a matter of fact. there's no perfect theology or philosophy in the past. What there are is ways to go, and they've gone off the rails, and we need to know why they've gone off the rails. And if we just go back to them, they'll go off the rails again.
But would you say it's quite simple that we have to return to God and we have to return to faith?
Well, you wouldn't necessarily have to start by returning to God. I think you should start by being honest. That's the first stage. Not to make false assumptions. To always query what's going on. I mean, I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about from one of the better more interesting Platonic dialogues. Socrates, as presented by Plato, believes that courage has something to do with knowledge of what is good and bad. In other words, courage means you should fear to be acting badly and be happy to act good, something like that. Well, in one of the dialogues, he's talking to a man who's a general, and this man comes up with a theory like which looks pretty close to what Socrates probably thought himself, and he says this. Socrates then blows it away. Because although this guy had mouthed the right answer, he didn't know why the answer was right. He couldn't justify it. And this is exactly what we're talking about now. See, all the time, the underlying claim of this book is people are saying things which may work in some sense for me. That's the phrase you often hear. Yeah. But you can't justify them philosophically. And in the end, if you can't do that, they're going to be disastrous.
Yes. Yes.
So the first thing is to clear the ground, get rid of all of the nonsense, and make people realise if the world is as it looks without God, as it were, is this the world which you think you actually live in or not? And of course it isn't, because now you've got these Kantian subterfuges and all the rest of it. You can make refuge there, but they don't work. So you've got to clear the ground so you can, like Socrates did. And then start building it up again, as it were. If you like, it's rediscovering the wheel, but it's got to be a rather better wheel than it was before. I mean, to some extent, this can mean things like correcting obvious mistakes in some members of the original tradition, and you can do that. But I think you've got to go wider than that. You've got to find out, as it were, how you would build, if you like, how would you build up the original tradition in our contemporary society against the problems that it faces, because the original tradition grew up in a different world, as it were. It had many similarities to our world, but it's not the same world. And every time one of these major challenges comes up, the world can't go back to where it was. So we can't solve the problems of the 20th century simply by going back, let's say, to the 13th or even to the 5th for Augustine. You can't do that. What you've got to do is to use what they've got right and then apply them to the immediate difficulties which will come up there once you recognise what they are. But of course, to recognise what they are comes from clearing away the rubble. Yeah. It comes from being honest, as it were.
But certainly there's more value in the, say, Augustine than obviously the later philosophers.
Yes, I mean, the point is, it's not so much they did what they get right, but what you've got to persuade people is that they do get it right. You've got to persuade them of that. See, it's no good knowing it, even if it's true that they do get it right. That's not enough. You've got to persuade the other person that they're right after, and that their little beliefs, which they picked up since the 16th century, are often wildly inaccurate. And the best way of showing that, as I say, is to show just how they just don't fit the world, in fact, as you see it, if you look at it honestly. That was why I gave the example about Augustine and his sort of cosy progressivism and so on. You shouldn't be able to say, though liberals do keep on saying, as it were, that human nature is perfectible. Because just so much evidence, not to do with belief in God at all. No, so much evidence that just isn't true, as it were. And so that you've got to accept, and then you start, what does that imply, and so on and so forth. So honesty is the first concern. In other words, we're concerned with truth, not with making things up, but with actually finding what things are like out there.
Well, and even before honesty, there's truth. There's objectively, the way things are.
The way things are, yes.
Most people, or maybe all of us, don't really have a quite accurate view of this, do we?
Well, the example I gave about human nature is a perfect example of that. We keep on pretending that things are not as they are.
Yes, yes.
So this is, I mean, this means you just can't start with God, because if you do that, no one's going to take any notice anymore. You've got to show that without him, there's a complete confusion. That's the aim, as it were. And then if you do that, then it'll be easier to rebuild the original tradition.
Right, right. Great. Is there anything perhaps we haven't touched on in the book which you'd like to draw out or mention?
The only thing I think it might be worth saying something about what's in the last chapter of the book, where I talk about John Rawls.
Yes, yes.
He's a prophet of contemporary liberal democracy, because he believes that there's such a thing as a neutral state. But there is no such thing as a neutral state, because the state is the individuals who run it, and they're not neutral. Even if they try to be, they can't be necessarily. So the notion that the neutral state will always treat its varying groups honestly and properly is just not true. And you see this all the time. I mean, why does the neutral state happen to persecute Christianity rather more than it does Islam, for example, in the West? Well, why does that happen? It's because the state isn't neutral and can't be neutral, and people need to recognise that. This is a very important anti-liberal claim. The state can't be in that role. This is also an kind of neocon claim as well, because the neocons talk about a minimal state, but that doesn't help either, because however minimal it is, it's still got to have certain policies, as it were, like it or not. And these won't be neutral. I mean, you've got to always be correcting them in the interest of in other words, you've got to admit that you can't have a neutral state, but you can attempt to get as neutral as you can without bringing in these claims that anybody who disagrees with the governing elite is an enemy of society or something like that. So I just want to. I mean, Rawls is the god of contemporary liberalism, and so he needs to be faced head on.
Yes. So thank you very much, Professor John and Anna Rist, for your time today and discussing this book. A very fascinating discussion.
Well, I was very glad to do it, and let's hope it helps to sell the book. And as Goebbels used to put it, all publicity is good publicity.
Very good.